Today's episode is brought to you by the German Book Prize winning Where You Come From by Sasha Stanisic, a novel translated by Damien Searles that blends autofiction, fable, and choose-your-own-adventure to tell the story of a Yugoslavian family in the 1990s whose world is uprooted and remade by war. Their history, their life before the conflict, and the years that followed their escape as they created a new life in Germany. Set in a village where only 13 people remain, in lost and made-up memories, in coincidences, in choices, and in a dragon's den, it's a novel about homelands, both remembered and imagined, lost and found. Says Jennifer Croft, Where You Come From is a triumph, funny and touching and subtly profound, as it ranges from chronicle to prose poem to folk tale. It builds a momentum that dazzles throughout, an exhilarating and powerful read. Where You Come From is out on December 7th from Tin House and available for pre-order now. Today's episode is also brought to you by Loners, the Making of a Street Library, out now from Perfect Day Publishing. In 2011, Laura Moulton founded Street Books, a mobile library serving people living outside in Portland, Oregon. That summer, Ben Hodgson became one of her most dedicated regulars, setting the still unbroken single-season record for book borrowing. Then, Ben's routine changed, and he didn't cross paths again with Laura for almost 2 years. Loners is the story they began to tell when they reconnected, offering a street-level perspective of a community whose stories are seldom told, alternating between their two unforgettable points of view in this addictively readable memoir. Quote, "The right book can change a person forever in a few hours' time," says Karen Russell. Anyone looking for evidence to pair with this grand claim of mine should read Loners immediately. And I'd like to add something to Karen Russell's comments here. As I watched Laura create this bike-powered mobile library for people living outside, issuing patrons street book library cards without them needing the typical proof of address, where it started as a small summer art project 10 years ago and has grown into a nonprofit with many paid librarians, including patrons who themselves have become librarians. I've seen her do this against all the biases, all the naysayers, that people living outdoors wouldn't be interested in reading or wouldn't return the books. There's a reason writer Omar El-Akkad calls street books one of the single best ideas he's seen in this town in Portland, Oregon. And there's a reason Laura's book with Ben Hodgson, one of her patrons who became a street librarian and now co-author with her of Loners, has become a local phenomenon. Given that we're heading into the gift-giving season, if you go to streetbooks.org/loners, you can check out a video trailer for the book, you can find a link to buy it, and you can check out Street Books itself for your holiday giving. I hope you do. And given that we're heading not only into gift-giving season, but also a time when we think of resolutions for the new year, perhaps you're a longtime listener of the show, have found these conversations meaningful for your own writing or for your own art making, or maybe simply meaningful and thought-provoking in their own right. Or perhaps this is your first listen or first read if you're reading the transcript, and you appreciate this long-form conversation today with Raymond Antrobus, a deep dive into, among many other things, a deaf and disability poetics and what this poetics means for all of us. Either way, whether long time or first time, perhaps it's a time to consider, as we head into 2022, transforming yourself from a listener/reader to a listener/reader supporter of Between the Covers, joining a community of people helping shape the future of the show. There are innumerable potential benefits, rewards, and gifts available for doing so. And you can check them all out at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And now for today's program with the poet Raymond Antrobus. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is British Jamaican poet, educator, writer, and self-described investigator of missing sounds, Raymond Antrobus. Antrobus first found a community of poets in the London slam and open mic scene where he won numerous poetry slams. He's the Farrago International Slam Champion of 2010. He won the Canterbury Slam in 2013 and was joint winner of the Open Calabash Slam in 2016. Antrobus's first published collection, his chapbook, Shapes and Disfigurements of Raymond Antrobus, came out in 2012. In 2017, he published his second chapbook, To Sweeten Bitter, the same year his poem Sound Machine was picked by Ocean Vuong for the Geoffrey Dearmer Award. But it was 2018, with the publication in the UK of his debut book, The Perseverance, when Antrobus found incredible widespread critical and public acclaim. Kaveh Akbar says of The Perseverance, "It's magic the way this poet is able to bring together so much: deafness, race, masculinity, a mother's dementia, a father's demise, with such dexterity. Raymond Antrobus is as searching a poet as you're likely to find writing today." Malika Booker adds, "The Perseverance is an insightful, frank, and intimate rumination of language, identity, heritage, loss, and the art of communication, ranging from tender elegies about his father to frank interrogations of deafness. Antrobus highlights the persistence of memory and our need to connect. These colloquial, historical, and conversational poems plunder the space of missing and absence in speech, our conversations, between what we hear and what we do not say. Thought-provoking and eloquent monologues explore the poet's Jamaican British heritage with such compassion, where the spirit and rhythm of each speaker dominates. These are courageous autobiographical poems of praise, difficulties, testimony, and love." The Perseverance was shortlisted for the Griffin Prize and the Forward Prize for Best First Collection, was the winner of the Sunday Times University of Warwick Young Writer Award, the Ted Hughes Award, the Somerset Maugham Award, and the Rathbones Folio Prize, the first poet to ever receive the award, and was a Poetry Book of the Year at The Guardian, The Sunday Times, and the Poetry School. Since then, 3 of Antrobus's poems have been added to the syllabus of the General Certificate of Secondary Education in the UK. He has received a fellowship with the Royal Society of Literature, become a member of the Order of the British Empire, headlined the London Book Fair as Poet of the Fair, hosted a BBC radio documentary, Inventions in Sound, performed at the Paralympic homecoming ceremony at Wembley Stadium, and even had a deaf school change the name of its building to his name, usurping Beethoven himself. Along the way, he's had poems published in Poetry, the Poetry Review, and the Deaf Poet Society, received a fellowship from Cave Canem, and was one of the world's first recipients of an MA in spoken word education from Goldsmiths University. He's a board member for English Pen, an advocate for Deaf Kids International and National Deaf Children's Society, and now also a writer of children's books, having published this year the book Can Bears Ski? illustrated by Polly Dunbar, and selected as the 2021 Ezra Jack Keats Book Award honoree. The original plan was to have Raymond on to talk about The Perseverance, which came out in North America in the spring of this year from Tin House. But when I learned that he had a new collection on the horizon, his first since his 2018 tour de force, and that it too was going to come out this year, both in the UK with Picador and in the US with Tin House, we decided to wait to discuss both books together, much as they have both arrived together here in North America in 2021. Raymond Antrobus' second full collection is called All the Names Given and is already shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. Kimon Felix says of All the Names Given, "This collection is a brave, tender, and generous piece of music where family is a chord forever troubled by the process of being named. With a knife-like precision, All the Names Given manages to caption the speaker's dance with the ghosts of his bloodline, offering us a haunting study on what we can find in the silences of history when history is recognized as more than a noun, when recognized as something alive and kinetic, something constantly in conversation with the present. I can't wait to see how this timely book ripples through our world. Welcome to Between the Covers, Raymond Antrobus."
Wow, thank you, David. An honor to be here, and what a thing to just sit and bathe in the light of one's biography. I'm like, oh my God, I really have been doing a lot.
I love. It felt like an incantatory biography of all of the things that have happened, particularly in the last 3 years.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I'm like, it's interesting as well hearing like the spoken words, kind of, I don't know, accolades in history, which is often not actually mentioned in like literary spaces. It's kind of compartmentalized in this way that I just noticed that seemed to just happen. So I actually appreciate hearing, you know, the breadth, the full kind of biography, the full journey of the work in a way.
Well, I want to first just congratulate you on becoming a new father and for having this interview within the early weeks of what you described as the incubation of your new family.
Yes.
Congratulations.
Yes. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Your poems often do focus on family as well as on ancestry and lineage, and at times your own childhood, being mothered and being fathered or not being so, and navigating being deaf before diagnosis and after. And both To Sweet and Bitter and The Perseverance are collections that are about, among many other things, your relationship with your own father, and also your first encounter of language, or one of your first encounters with language, being him reading to you. So I thought, in honor of your newborn son and you yourself becoming a father, maybe we could just open up with the poem "Happy Birthday Moon," if you would be willing to introduce it to us and read it.
Yeah. This is a nice place to begin. So Happy Birthday Moon is a pantoum I wrote. It's the last poem in The Perseverance. And I guess the difficult question it asks is, where does language begin for me? And, you know, the memory that was evoked with that question was, you know, being read to by my father at nighttime. And there's a particular book called Happy Birthday Moon, the same title of the poem, which I would often ask to be read to. The book is a children's picture book, and it's about a bear that lives out in the woods, the forest, and this one particular night stands on the highest hill of his wood, looks up at the sky, sees a full moon, and the bear says, "It's my birthday." And the bear's voice echoes through the forest, through the valleys, through the trees, and he hears his echo. "It's my birthday." And he looks at the moon and he says, "Wow, It's the moon's birthday too. And it sets up this kind of what I recognize now as a deaf poetic device, a kind of call and response. Because in the being a deaf person or a hard of hearing person in the hearing world, you're often asking people to repeat, you know. And then when you're kind of looking at different poetry forms and how many of the most enduring poetry forms depend on that poetic device of repetition, there's just such a kind of fusion of opportunity and play in language. And one thing I should also say is my dad had a very deep voice. And so the kind of deafness I have, I don't hear any high-pitched sounds. I don't hear anyone who has like a light voice. I hear like bassy sounds, deeper pitch sounds, a lot more fluidly. So my dad had this kind of presence in his voice that I kind of had a relationship with in itself. And that, I think, comes into this poem. Happy Birthday, Moon. Dad reads aloud. I follow his finger across the page. Sometimes his finger moves past words tracing white space. He makes the moon say something new every night to his deaf son who slurs his speech. Sometimes his finger moves past words tracing white space. Tonight he gives the moon my name, but I can't say it. His deaf son who slurs his speech. Dad taps the page, says, try again. Tonight he gives the moon my name, but I can't say it. I say, Raymond Antrobus. He laughs. Dad taps the page, says, try again. But I like making him laugh. I say my mistake again. I say, Raymond Antrobus. He laughs, says, Raymond, there's something else. I like making him laugh. I say my mistake again. Raymond Antrobus. What else will help us? He says, Raymond, there's something else. I'd like to be the moon, the bear, even the rain. Raymond Antrobus. What else will help us hear each other, really hear each other? I'd like to be the moon, the bear, even the rain. Dad makes the moon say something new every night, and we hear each other, really hear each other. As Dad reads aloud, I follow his finger across the page.
Been listening to Raymond Antrobus read from his first full collection of poetry, The Perseverance. So you call yourself the investigator of missing sounds. In this poem that we just heard, it is the way you speak before your parents realize you are deaf that we hear. But in many places in your poetry, it is what you don't hear, the missing sounds. The book you just read from, The Perseverance, it opens with an epigraph from Robin Cost Lewis. And that epigraph goes, there is no telling what language is inside the body. But this line is a mishearing of her reading her poem, which is written on the page as, there is no telling what languishes inside the body. And your first children's book that came out recently, which nicely creates this circle with Happy Birthday Moon, I think. Your book, Can Bears Ski, is named after what you heard when people would ask you, can you hear me? And what strikes me the most is how the missing sounds have affected your name. Both you're speaking of it in Happy Birthday Moon, and the way you hear it. And as you mentioned, not hearing the highest pitch sounds. So what we learn in the poem Echo is that when people would say Antrobus, you would hear Antrob. And that you thought your name for a while was Antrob. But thinking about a name as part of our sense of self, and you both speaking it and hearing it differently, what strikes me is that when the deaf school wanted to change their building name from Beethoven House to Antrobus House, you wanted them to change it to Antrob House, which is what it is. And this gesture of you naming your children's book after a quote unquote mishearing suggests to me this might be a clue into your poetics. And I wondered if you could talk about the investigation of missing sounds in light of the way you, in both of these cases, are centering what you actually hear, the way you actually hear these sounds, not what you are quote unquote supposed to hear.
Right. Yeah, for sure. That is such a concise take on what I call is my poetic practice of deafness, or deaf poetics, as Ilya Kaminsky would say. Something I noticed in my early work of trying to get poems published was often with editors, or often my conversations around my work were kind of people asking me to explain, correct, clarify, like things, moments like that, mishearings. And it seemed like people were kind of often telling me, no, you can't, you can't confuse your reader. And my argument would be, I'm not confusing my reader. I'm bringing them closer to what the experience is. I don't assume that all my readers are hearing people. I assume that my readers are also interested in what we would also call, I think Meg Day called it, a mythology of silence, a mythology of noise, of sound, which is this strange idea that everyone has the same experience with sound. You either can hear or you can't. And that binary is a lie. So, I realized that in my work, this is what I was trying to do. I was trying to, one, assert what my relationship with sound and language is. And I'm also trying to disrupt a kind of mainstream assumed idea of what sound and language is. And I'm doing that through the prism of poetry, where all of these kind of investigations, testimonies, passions of mine meet. Because I was raised on poetry. I've said this so many times now about, my parents, like, even though both my parents weren't poets, they loved poetry. So I had this really rich childhood in terms of kind of what they call culture capital. And so I never felt like being a poet or pursuing poetry was something that I couldn't do, was something outside of the imagination for me. And this was a complete accident in itself. So even that is a kind of, it aligns with the idea of a mishearing or a disruption or an accident. Like, I think when my parents, particularly my dad, realized that I was trying to pursue poetry, he was confused and was kind of like, well, wait, how do poets make money again? What right. Is it that they do? Like, and then I had to kind of revise that. I had to stop telling him that I was trying to be a poet, and I had to tell him that I was being a teacher. As soon as I told him I was being a teacher, it's more of a kind of traditional job description, he kind of relaxed a bit and was like, okay, that's respectable. You can pursue that. Yeah. Yeah. So, but the kind of question about like the mishearings is, and what that is. Have I gone off on a tangent? Am I still answering your question?
No, you still are answering my question, but I'm going to make my question more difficult in the spirit of some difficult questions you've posed. So, okay. In your companion piece for your latest book, the BBC radio documentary, Inventions in Sound, you look at the art of translating sound for the eye, and you ask your deaf artist guests what seem to be really evocative questions, but also, at least to me, really impossible questions.
Right.
Like, what is sound? And similarly, in the middle of your new book, All the Names Given, you have a 2-page spread, one blank and the other that is mostly so, with only a short quote from the deaf sound artist Christine Sun Kim, where she poses a similar question: what does sound mean for us? And at the end of your US version of the Perseverance, there's a question and answer section between you and Ilya Kaminsky. And he asks you what noise is for you. So in the spirit of the questions you've asked each other, talk to us about sound and about noise, both for you now, but also perhaps also how it's changed and evolved for you through the years of puzzling through your sense of identity, and how you want to orient, as you've already mentioned, both to the hearing and deaf worlds as an audience. What are sound and noise?
Again, yeah, you're right. Rich, impossible questions, but I can ground myself in this question in a number of ways. I can ground myself in the kind of medical language of how I would answer that. So I would then talk about how my deafness was discovered when I was around 7 years old and had to be given hearing aids. And so from the age of 7 to now, I've had so many different kinds of hearing aids, and the technology and the evolution of technology over that time, over the last, 25 years, has been rapid, powerful, really incredible gains in hearing aid technology and what it is. So the kind of hearing aids and the kind of way I experienced sound as a kid, as a 7-year-old, even a teenager, even in school, very different. So for how long? Only for about 3 years now, I've been wearing digital hearing aids, which are really clear. They also have an external mic to them, so there's an app on my phone, and I can connect the hearing aids to the app on the phone, where the powerful technology that's in the iPhone, it also serves as a additional microphone for me to pick up sound. So it was so interesting to me that I could remember my dad, as the hearing aid technology improved. I can remember this perplexing him and being like, is your hearing getting better, or is it just me? And I'm like, well, no, but technology is getting better. I mean, also, and this is, I suppose, a bit of, how can I say this? Just digression. A side note that, like, because I've been wearing hearing aids for so long, and my brain is quite well adapted to them. And on top of that, I've had years of speech therapy, years of hearing therapy. I've had all of this pretty intense medical support to help me function in the hearing world. And it's only actually as an adult, particularly as a teacher going into classrooms, into deaf and hearing schools, that I come to realize how, or that kind of being in that space gave me the perspective of how I don't know, privileged actually that journey has been for me, because most deaf students I interact with, even today, haven't had that kind of care. And that's partly because in the UK, we're going to get even more political now. We're going to talk about funding and how children with special educational needs are often mismanaged, unsupported, misunderstood, falling through the cracks of a system. And this isn't just significant to the UK, this is a worldwide thing. I've gone into deaf classrooms, not only in the UK, but also in the US, in the parts of the Caribbean and parts of Europe. And I've seen this consistent kind of challenge for deaf, particularly for deaf young people, in an education system, kind of, just being totally unsupported, unheard. And I've been writing kind of anecdotally, some of the conversations I've had in those classrooms, none of that has been kind of published yet. I'm still figuring out what to do with this and how to kind of present it as a kind of case against ableism and as a kind of testimony, an empowerment, a self-affirmation kind of document for the care and support and funding for the education of deaf young people everywhere, or deaf people everywhere. So I've just rooted myself in the kind of medical, political kind of area. Philosophically, I mean, I don't know where to begin with it, but I do like what Meg Day said. I mean, I've already said it, but about this idea of sound being a morphology to hearing people. And as a poet, or as poets, we get to, in a way, revise and create our own kind of mythologies, our own, the relationship that we want to have with sound is something that we can explore through our poetry. And again, like, it's not just philosophy, deafness is rooted, deaf as a culture, it's rooted in its history of its education of the deaf, and the history of sign language, which is a really complicated, fragmentary one all over the world. The history of deaf communities and the way that they've developed differently in their language, and then as writers, as activists, as academics, we get to align ourselves with that, what we call capital D deafness, which is kind of outside and beyond the medical. So the medical language. So it is, it's huge, it's wide. I still feel like I'm kind of skating on an iceberg right now, just with that.
Yeah, no. That was a great, obviously brief tour through these through these questions, but I loved when you asked your guests on the BBC what their relationship to radio was, given that the program you were producing on the radio and the radio as a medium was one that excluded you and them in a sense through the way it's not your program, but the radio itself as a medium is largely not thinking of you and them as a technology. And I love their answers. So you mentioned Meg Day and they were mentioning how the radio feels like a drum for them, and that you could put your hand on it and feel its vibration. And they also mentioned how they would notice, people would congregate around it. It was something that brought people together. And another guest said her and her friends would fiddle with the radio dial in the car while driving until they found something with a lot of bass, something that they could feel in their body as vibration, which made me think of your dad's low voice and you lying on his chest when he read to you. But it also made me wonder if we could extend something of Robert Frost's notion of the sense in poetry not being in the words but in their sound. In his idea, he was saying that if you hear someone speaking on the other side of the wall to someone else, you can't hear the actual words, but you hear the music and the rhythm and the volume and the tone. It's in all of those things where the meaning lies. And I wondered if we could take that further and say, maybe there's something tactile and bodily also in the vibrations, that meaning can arrive this way in the vibrations. And it makes me wonder about the captioning throughout your latest book. Captioning we might normally think of seeing while watching a film or a TV show, but you include captions between poems and within poems in a way that feels like it's doing something very different than that. So even though we normally think of accessibility with captions, in this case, it seems like it may even be another mode of language in the book.
Yes.
And maybe it's another mode of language the way we could imagine touching the radio and feeling the vibrations of the radio is another language of the radio. But talk to us. I don't know if I'm going in the right way, but talk to us about captioning, because the captioning in your second book, the one that just came out, is very prominent, and I feel like it just brings up a lot of curiosity for me.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, there's again so much there. You know, what you just said about Robert Frost is so true. I also think of E.E. Cummings, who has a line that says something like, "There's a universe next door. Let's go." And that's like the way out of this poem. And then he had this way for me of like, when I remember being really stimulated and excited by quite a bit of E.E. Cummings, because it's not just not just the brevity of his lyric, but it was also this way in which it made you look at the white space around the poem. It charged it in a whole new way for me. And this was years ago. This was when I was, you know, probably like reading him maybe when I was about 21, 22. But I remember having a very particular kind of revelation while reading him. And I get like that. I get obsessions with individual kind of poets, which become very concentrated and intense. So yeah, you bringing up the Robert Frost made me think of the time I was into E.E. Cummings in that way. So what you say about the captions and the different languages and the different mediums, the different ways of being through sound, through through spoken language and heard language or felt language. Yes, all of that. So one of the other things I was trying to do with all of my work, I suppose, is have different versions of it. So, you know, All the Names Given and The Perseverance, that yes, they are books, they are kind of documents, but they're also, you know, audio books. They're also sound projects. There's audio versions of those books, which are slightly different. If you come to see me perform, and I'm working with a few of my friends are really great British Sign Language translators and performers, and I've been working with some of them, Velma Jackson, Anna Kitson, Jackie Beckford in particular, ones that just three names of BSL performers that I've worked with. And so, you know, that kind of performance or that collaboration of the spoken word, the written word, the performed word, the seen word, the invisible word, like, you know, that is also having a kind of living life. I'm interested in the book or the book, not just as a singular thing. I'm trying to make living documents, you know. Who is it? I think it might have been in an interview with Chen Chen, the poet Chen Chen, years ago, who said something like, we ought to revise towards aliveness. I remember that, like, that idea of aliveness and feeling so invigorated by that. Like, what does that mean? I really investigated, like, why am I so moved by this, by the use of that word aliveness in the context of poetry and revision and performance and writing. And I think that this is something that unearthed for me. This is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to create living documents and show that language itself is a living kind of technology, a living kind of organism. And if we engage with that critically, poetically, creatively, we are living, you know, we ourselves become alive in it, you know. At least that's how I felt. So now I'm going to try and ground myself in what you say about, like, you know, where the captions idea came from. So the story of that is during the pandemic, I'd written the first draft of All the Names Given without captions, in fact. And I felt like there was something missing in the book in terms of sequencing. The first draft of the book had a lot of sequences. For example, what you said about my name, Antrobus, and not only about the kind of mishearing and the history of that name, but also like the very real etymological history of that name. It's a locational name. Anyone with the name Antrobus can be linked to a town in Cheshire, Middle England, a tiny little village. Also a gift for a poet, really. So I went to this village and had a day there with my mother, and I wrote about that in All the Names Given. And while I was writing that poem, I thought I was writing a very different, specific kind of book. But then the pandemic happened, and I moved to the US, and I was involved in a whole complicated visa immigration process because I was married, but I wasn't yet given a green card. Anyway, yeah, that's a whole long tangential story. But while with the pandemic, my wife, her name is Tabitha, and me were separated. She had to stay in the States. I had to stay in the UK, and I began just watching loads of TV, loads of media content. I'm not a big TV watcher. I never have been. So I felt guilty actually at first watching all of these TV episodes, like just loads of stuff, and kind of catching up on the cultural moment actually that TV is having. But I was watching all of this content with captions. I'd watch anything with captions. I don't watch anything that isn't captions. And I found that I needed to engage creatively to alleviate myself of the guilt I felt watching so much TV. I think that my parents really hit it home for me that, like, we shouldn't be spending all of our time in front of the TV, eating sweets, having our eyes go square, So I'm like, how do I subvert this and create this into worthwhile time? And then suddenly it dawned on me, I was watching films which I watched as a kid, which were never captioned. And when I was watching them with the captions and realized that I had a completely different understanding of what was going on in these films, because these were films that I was watching on VHS as a kid with my friends. Some of them are like violent films, which we had to watch it with the volume turned down because the parents might hear us and come in and be like, what are you watching that's got all this violence in it? I'm hearing people screaming, I'm hearing gunfire, all this stuff. So I was rewatching all of these films, like, Boys in the Hood was one that I'd never watched with subtitles until the pandemic. Oh man, there's so many, but they skip my mind now. I just realized that I had a completely different sense of these films, and I felt almost disorientated by it. And I was like, I realized that actually the stories that I had of some of these films were my own inventions. And so I wanted to take that further. And then I remembered I happened to see Christine Sun Kim's exhibition in London in 2015, and it was called Closer Captions. And Christine Sun Kim, as you say, an amazing deaf sound artist whose whole philosophy is a similar thing to mine, of like kind of disrupting what the hearing world's relationship or assumptions with sound is, and trying to revise or challenge actually the sound in this way. And so she did this thing of asking four of her deaf friends, to write the captions or rewrite the captions for a scene in The Little Mermaid. And it's the scene where it's revealed that Ariel has lost her voice. And so you see in the corner of this room 4 screens that playing that same scene from The Little Mermaid on a loop, and every each individual screen is the same scene but captioned differently. And I remember being just blown away by that. Visually beautiful and complicated, but conceptually as well, just so rich. And I never, I don't know, a light bulb went off, and I thought, oh, I can incorporate this within this. This is deaf poetics again. And then I was watching a film which had loads of high-pitched sounds in it, so I didn't hear many of the sounds in this film, but the captions would say things like, you know, they were cueing me, so the captions would say things like bell rings, birds squawking, telephone goes, you know, whatever. And I'm reading the captions and I'm not hearing the sound. And when I realize that this is a conceptual experience for me to read this piece of language, a description of a sound, which you then don't hear. It's conceptual, it's completely abstract. And then I realized if you just write them down, if you put captions on a page, that democratizes that experience to everyone. Because then no one can really hear what it is. And then what it does is it invites your imagination into that sound. And so when I started putting these kind of captions in the book, in the manuscript, you know, and I was realizing that they serve as a kind of transitional device, as well as a kind of evocative, poetic and a mode. You know, like I really wanted to not be like doing it for the sake of it. It really had to be grounded in deaf poetics, but specifically into the book, because the book is like a kind of splurge or an emotional and in some ways historical response to me trying to articulate some of my shared history with my mother, actually, in growing up. And it was my mom who was my biggest campaigner and ambassador to get me hearing aids, to get me into deaf schools, to ensure that, you know, I got that support I was talking about earlier on. So I really wanted the book to be, and it is, I say that quite explicitly in the book, that it is a book for her, because I have the relationship I have with sound because of, in a way, her vigilance and her campaigning. Yeah, I know. Sorry, I've been talking for a long time.
No, that was fantastic. I want to actually, I want to stay with these questions of technologies of exclusion and also questions of accessibility and what you mentioned, democratization of experience. But before we do, I was hoping maybe we could start with you reading the poem Echo. It's not one of the caption poems, but I think it would be a good introduction to some of the questions that I have that would follow it.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I just give a quick context to Echo. Echo is the opening poem or the opening sequence of the Perseverance. I wrote it. It was literally the first poem I wrote after my dad had passed away, and we were pretty close. And I found myself having to just get away on my own, just take a trip somewhere after his funeral, and I ended up in Barcelona, and I stayed there on my own for a week. And the first place I went while in Barcelona was Gaudi's Cathedral, and I took the audio guide, and then the audio guide had told me that there's a particular design of the roof of the Gaudi's Cathedral where you were invited to stand and look up into the roof and shout and sing and be vigilant of how sound moves. And then the audio guide explains how the way you experience sound under that particular roof is how angels experience it. And I was having that experience artificially, through hearing aids, and I was like, well, are deaf people invited into this idea of divinity and holy sound that we ought to be experiencing? So that question kind of brought forth this sequence called Echo. My ear amps whistle as if singing to Echo, goddess of noise, the raveled knot of tongues, of blaring birds, consonant crumbs, of dull doorbells, sounds swamped in my misty hearing aid tubes. Gaudi believed in holy sound and built a cathedral to contain it, pulling hearing men from their knees as though deafness is a kind of atheism. Who would turn down God? Even though I have not heard the golden decibel of angels, I have been living in a noiseless palace where the doorbell is pulsating light and I am able to answer. What? A word that keeps looking in mirrors in love with its own volume. What? I am a one-word question, a one-man patience test. What? What language would we speak without ears? What? Is paradise a world where I hear everything? What? How will my brain know what to hold if it has too many arms? The day I clear out my dead father's flat, I throw away boxes of molding LPs, Garvey, Malcolm X, Mandela, speeches on vinyl. I find a TDK cassette tape on the shelf. The smudged green label reads, Raymond speaking. I play the tape in his vintage cassette player and hear my 2-year-old voice chanting my name, Antrob, and Dad's laughter crackling in the background, not knowing I couldn't hear the word bus and wouldn't until I got my hearing aids. Now I sit here listening to the space of deafness. Antrob, Antrob, Antrob. And if you don't catch nothing, then something wrong with your ears. They've been tuned to the wrong frequency. Kai Miller. So maybe I belong to the universe underwater, where all songs are smeared wailings for Salacia, goddess of salt water, healer of infected ears, which is what the doctor thought I had, since deafness did not run in the family but came from nowhere. So they syringed olive oil and salt water, and we all waited to see what would come out. And no one knew what I was missing until a doctor gave me a handful of Lego and said to put a brick on the table every time I heard a sound. After the test, I still held enough bricks in my hand to build a house and call it my sanctuary, call it the reason I sat in saintly silence during my grandfather's sermons when he preached the good news I only heard as Babylon's babbling echoes.
Been listening to Raymond Antrobus reading from his first full collection of poetry, The Perseverance. I wanted to take this poem as a departure point to discuss exclusion further. I mean, obviously we have this sense of the architecture of this church, kind of like the radio in a sense, as a architecture of exclusion. But this question of can deaf people experience divinity has a legacy. Not only were deaf people written off as lacking intellectual capacity forever, for centuries or millennia, but sometimes it was questioned whether they had souls to redeem. And it was an abbot in 18th century France who believed they did, that eventually led to the development of the first fully developed sign language. But in thinking of the Gaudi Cathedral in this light, you've quoted in conversations about this poem a line from Rilke's Duino Elegies, where he said, "Who, if I cried out, would hear me among the hierarchy of angels?" And then also Philip Larkin, when he describes the same church as a, quote, tense, musty, unignorable silence. And both of these quotes sort of inverting the narrative on the church. But I was reading a roundtable that Poetry International put together of disability poetics and deaf poetics, a series of roundtables. And one person on the panel was a deaf-blind poet named John Lee Clark, who says he isn't able to read nearly any contemporary poetry because no one seems to care about Braille readers and poetry. So his main source of reading material is Project Gutenberg, which means only poets who have been dead for the required 90 years.
Yeah.
So he's often startled when someone says to him that his poetry reminds them of Frank O'Hara or Robert Lowell, because he's never read Frank O'Hara or Robert Lowell, that G.K. Chesterton or Christina Rossetti would be the poets he would think of as influences. And then I think of two readings of Ilya Kaminsky that you attended. One where he had a hearing poet read his poems after he read them, and another where he handed out printouts of his poetry so people could read along as he spoke in case one didn't understand his words as he said them. And all of this made me think of questions of both accessibility and of audience, because obviously with Ilya Kaminsky, we're talking about making his poetry spoken accessible to the hearing world. And that's the opposite question for John Lee Clark. You've talked about how the word accessible in poetry and literature has a stigma, that if you make art accessible, the common notion is that you're dumbing it down. But as an educator and a poet, two things that you've said are very deeply linked for you. Accessibility is important. And I was hoping maybe we could talk about this, and thinking of John Lee Clark and of the Gaudi Cathedral and of Ilya Kaminsky's attempts to give different portals into his poetry. Talk to us more about your considerations regarding both your written and performed poetry in that regard, around these questions of exclusion and inclusion and democratization of experience.
Yeah, I mean, that is, again, a huge but useful conversation to have. And one that, there's no one size fits all for this. And it feels like so much is erupting in our culture right now. So many things are being kind of pulled apart. Institutions are being ridiculed and asked to revise their principles and their code of conducts and all this kind of stuff. So really, this is a great time to talk about the considerations that just, or you could say the people that aren't often brought into these kinds of conversations because they're just not accessible. So I'm a big fan of John Lee Clark and his work. So I love, and I've never met him. So I love that he's been brought in here. And obviously Ilya Kaminsky is like a friend, but a kind of, I don't know, I'm hesitating to say this, almost like a kind of mentor figure to me, actually. I'm hesitating to put a label on it because that doesn't quite feel right. But he's basically a poet I look up to, and I check in on to see what they're up to, So yeah, this idea of accessibility. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think what you say about the kind of dumbing down of assumed dumbing down of it is to make it accessible is something I noticed when looking at criticism actually of my work. I saw that someone had said something like, "Oh, my work is I don't know, along the lines of accessible to a fault," and I found that such a interesting. I know I was offended. I'll just say that. Yeah. I was offended because I felt like, well, I don't feel like you've understood, uh, my intentions of the work and my history. Because, at school, um, when I was at school, I was often told that, I couldn't write, that I had learning difficulties, that I was probably dyslexic. I couldn't write in a straight line, all this kind of stuff that I was pathologized with. And I came to realize that one of the reasons these assumptions were being put on me were racial. For example, I remember having a teacher who the day she learned that my father was Jamaican, suddenly started asking if I was smoking weed, and why I was overheard saying words like "oh, Bumba Clark," which would, but words that just make my dad absolutely howl just a lot. But they didn't take too kindly to my patois. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, and I could see how, even reading my school reports, I could see how all of these kind of assumptions were made about me, and then my deafness, and then the statistic that I often think about, an estimated 75% of people born profoundly deaf in the UK grow up illiterate, and that's like that's a complicated statistic because it's not entirely true. It's like, what do you mean by literate and illiterate? Literate to who? Because a lot of these people are fully functioning, articulate British Sign Language users, and lip readers, and people who have other modes of communication and articulation. So, again, this is what I'm saying. Like, there's no kind of one size fits all, and even presenting statistics to you wouldn't present a full picture of how to create a truly inclusive, but also fair and critical world or space. One of the things I got asked about after a reading I did with, like I said, my friend of mine who are BSL interpreters, was from a deaf man who described himself as illiterate, said he doesn't write or he said he didn't write or think in English, which I thought I like that he stated that, actually. And he said to me, when is the publishing industry gonna catch up with QR codes? So there's so he showed me how he has some books which are translated into QR codes, so he can use his phone to see or to read in sign language the text. And not even I'd seen it before, and that was an actual revelation to me, and again was something that I couldn't stop thinking about when putting out my own book, because I don't have QR codes in my books. I don't have Braille versions of my books. It's something I want to do. It's something, but also I'm not a publisher. Like, it's not just on the authors to create that. We need an industry that creates that. But at the same time, maybe authors need to say that, refuse to have their work published without these different versions. And I suppose in some ways, some of my poetics are an attempt to compensate, for these over. I'm even going to use a piece of interesting language now. Oversight,
Let me suggest a reframing and see what you think of it. So a reframing of the offensive characterization of you as accessible, as your work being accessible to a fault, because it feels to me like accessibility is a continual question and concern in your work, but that at any given moment, that a given moment in your work is accessible not always to the same audience. And so it's less accessible to certain audiences at a given moment and more accessible in a different moment. Because when I think about it, like, I think it's obvious, at least to me, we can see you as the educator in your collections. And that has no subtext. Like, I'm not saying that as like some sort of veiled critique, because it isn't for me, but I think of like the further you have further reading lists at the end of your books, which I really appreciate. You have notes at the end of the book that talk about the references and influences. You know, some collections have neither of those. Those are prominent in your books. But there are these ways, it feels to me like the books are shifting modes around accessibility, where in one moment, maybe you're more accessible to a hearing audience, in one moment, more accessible to a deaf audience. We have the presence of sign in the books, with the drawings of sign. There are poems that end with a sign that in performance would be more or less legible to a given listener / viewer. But when I read them as a person who doesn't know sign, that's going to be a moment of less accessibility, perhaps, for me. So that goes against this critique, I think, of, in my opinion, like this shifting notion of it, but it also raises questions of audience. And then I'm also thinking of the signs of the book are in British Sign Language. And I mention this because, unlike British English and American English, which are variants of the same language, British Sign Language and American Sign Language are entirely different languages. And you've decided not to translate the signs when the book has moved from the UK to North America. So that's a question of accessibility within the deaf audience. And you've also mentioned in interviews you felt that the perseverance might open you up to critique from certain sectors of the deaf world. All of this, again, brings back this question. Well, at first it points to, I think, a much more sophisticated relationship to accessibility than what was leveraged against you. But it also raises this question of audience to me, and whether that question of audience for you is indeed shifting from moment to moment. If you could talk about that maybe a little bit, who is being brought in and when, doesn't feel like it's a stable thing when I read your books.
Yeah, no, for sure. That is a poetic decision as well for me, kind of, the poetics of uncertainty is in my work. I also try, who is it? It might have even been your conversation with Ross Gay, when Ross Gay was talking about generosity and gratitude, and that being its own kind of poetic. I was really invigorated again by those ideas, and how you bring in practices that you want to see in the world. This isn't actually just writing for I'll speak for myself and say, like, it's not just writing for me. I think I do align it with my work with a kind of spiritual practice, in that I am trying to create a tangible thing out of language, which actually brings about practical change. And that's an interesting thing to do, because, like, that kind of gap between action and language is actually quite a large gap. But not if you're writing, in my case, like, I'm writing books, I'm writing different versions of those books, and I'm going into the spaces where I think some of the most groundbreaking change in our society takes place, which is in the classroom. Also going into prisons and meeting, I've gone to a number of men's prisons now, and that's always been such a kind of powerful and evocative place. You talk about exclusion and invisibility, and even this idea of something that people are talking more and more about now, of like transgressions in our work. Like, you know, if we're going to be truthful in our work, we're not going to be saints. You know what I mean? Like, so, you know, it's complicated. It's a complicated thing to. I know I've just kind of opened up about 10 different lids there.
That's good. We could just open them up.
Yeah. So like, what you said about how, yeah, the tin house, the US versions of my book still have BSL in them. That was a conscious decision. You know, because I don't know American Sign Language. So you're right, it's so different, so much more like, it seems to me from the outside, just observing it, there's a lot more finger spelling in it. And I'm not the best finger speller, even in BSL. So I get so lost with the spelling. Like, oh no.
Yeah.
So like, but also for me, keeping the integrity of the sign, which I have a relationship with, a very sign specific place that, you know, BSL, I went to a deaf school in North London. I learned BSL. I learned to, you know, the deaf world. The work is conscious of its site, of its space. So even in that kind of transatlantic, I know, translation, I kind of felt a need to ground it still within my own context.
Yeah.
And you're right. That's complicated because there's also an exclusionary kind of.
Well, and your own context, grounding something in your own context is also complicated. And I wanted to spend a moment with that too, because it feels like there are many ways your life and your work exists in an in-between, but also insists upon not collapsing the tensions in favor of one side or the other. So you went to school in both hearing and deaf schools. You were teased by hearing students when they saw you signing, and deaf students would mock you for your lack of fluency in sign, calling you a baby signer, or if they saw you speaking instead of signing, wondered if you thought you were better than them. And because you have really high quality hearing aids, ones that are now small and not super visible, people have said to you, you don't look deaf, or they might not know that you are. And you've mentioned that's been hard, particularly during the pandemic, because you can't lip read when everyone has masks on.
Right.
But this is also true for you around race. You've talked about how people have said to you, you don't look Black. And you have many poems like Ode to My Hair or Jamaican British that engage with your mixed heritage. But you also have a poem in the new collection where you are filling out your marriage registration and it asks your race and you fill it out Black-white. And that feels like, to me, like a really rare move, at least in American racial discourse, where nearly everyone in your shoes would call themselves Black. But we see you insisting upon both aspects equally. And in both books, we see you traveling up both lines of your family tree, which with what seems like equal emphasis. Even the opening of All the Names Given enacts this gesture where the first poem has the line, "Give thanks for your name, Antrobus," which is your white British name. And the next poem, we find you in Jamaica engaging with the Orisha of deafness. So I wondered if we could talk about what feels like this insistence. I don't know if we call it even-handedness, but this, but if this insistence on not collapsing the binary one way or the other, and if that is something that is shaping your poetics.
Oh yeah, I mean, for art to be interesting, you need contrast and you need conflict, and when you can pinpoint the the two sides of that, and then you have to align, you have to make that line of having these two seemingly opposing things both be true despite their contradiction. And that's great for any artist, really. It's just, but it plays directly into, I think, my trauma, and seems to be a trauma of a lot of people who grow up with a need to identify in a certain way or articulate themselves. Like they struggle to be understood for who they are, and there's a need to develop a language or presentation for that. Turns out, though, that is actually a really universal thing, and that as I've got older, I've come to really understand or see, it seems like actually most people feel misunderstood. Most people, it seems, I've met in my life anyway, are often battling some kind of childhood trauma or some kind of misunderstanding, and have that kind of urge to be fully understood. I mean, and then there are people who just don't really care. Just like, I don't mind. Let me be a mythology, let me be an enigma or what's the word, anomaly. But yeah, so I think for my own kind of practice as a poet, as a writer, as a creative thinker, I've grounded myself in that very kind of personal, complicated, contradictory territory. And even looking at the hierarchy of what, it's so clearly a hierarchy in the Western world of the kind of over-privileging, I think, of the written word, and the kind of often assumed primitivization of the spoken word or the performed word. And then there's this really interesting, I mean, this might be a judgment. So, people feel free to push back against me on this, but it seems it's like in order to justify say the oral tradition, it always has to be rooted in Greek. It's like whoa, because of Homer, this is as a way to kind of validate it. And it's just, I know, because when I think about, again, my own upbringing, and I mentioned in the poem about my dad's tapes and how my dad's love of poetry wasn't limited to the written word, and neither of my parents, and there was no binary between a poet who was performing folklore like Miss Louise Bennett, or Jean Binter-Breeze, or Linton Kwesi Johnson, these kind of dub poets, they call them. There's no reason to reduce them and their craft, and say that they're not as, I don't know, sophisticated or worthy as, say, a poet who we only know through their written words, like John Keats or Wordsworth, or these romantic poets who, when you read their lives, actually had really complicated relationships with language too. John Keats was a working class man from East London who was ridiculed constantly for his dialect, his colloquial way of speaking. He was Cockney. The critics said he had no place in poetry, and all of that context of someone like Keats has been erased often, it seems. And it often takes a working class scholar or someone with a deeper appreciation for the range of language and what language says about one's identity to kind of exhume that context to Keats. I think it's a really important context to him, actually. So, I see and I notice how one's contradictions and complications ought to be embraced if they are going to be truthful and useful, because otherwise we're putting out propaganda, you know. Otherwise we find ways to you know, to just kind of tell a half truth about someone or something, and people can get hurt or harmed in that, you know. And that's something I talk about, or I have spoke about a bit in my poems, like you know, like how there's a real danger that we're in if we fail and keep failing to really understand each other on a in you know, in the most kind of human way.
Maybe this is a good time to hear a first poem from the new collection. And I was thinking of Plantation Paint, if you'd be open to introducing us to that, which I think also is a poem that looks at two sides of race, but also again with the word and the image too.
Yeah, so Plantation Paint is a poem. So like I said, like I thought I was writing a very different book about Antrobus and my name. And so given what I've already shared about the Antrobus name, I kind of end up having to abandon that because I felt like I had to be in England to write that book. But then with the pandemic, just before the pandemic had kind of really taken on and caused a shutdown everywhere, I was living in New Orleans, and I came across a painting called a Plantation Burial, which is in the historic New Orleans collection. And so I'm looking at the painting. If you're listening to this, I'd recommend maybe Googling it, just Plantation Burial, so you can see the painting. And so I was really struck. It's a huge canvas that this is on, and I was really struck by it. And it wasn't until though I looked at the description on the wall, and it said the painter's name, and it was John Antrobus, painted in 1860, oil on canvas. And it just kind of, again, created such a, what felt like an intergalactic kind of experience, to see that, you know. And I thought, okay, well, I already know this is going to be a poem. Who is a poet now that I could summon to help guide me through writing a poem like this? And I instantly thought of Lorna Goodison. She's a former poet laureate of Jamaica, but as well as a poet, she is a painter. And she's written collections actually about the practice of writing poetry and painting. And she's got one particular poem called, I think it's called To Paint various sorts of black, and it's about how black paint is made. Now my wife is her name's Tabitha. She's a art conservator. She was looking at this painting, and she was explaining how the men that are in this painting, the black men, their skin, that the paint that's used to depict their skin is of such a low earthy quality that, you know, those men, without proper care, without professional care of an art conservator, would deteriorate, would disappear from that painting. I mean, it turns out that, you know, loads of work has been done recently x-raying 17th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century paintings, and they've found black figures in the x-rays because they weren't conserved. They disappeared from the paintings. Wow. I mean, the conservators that had come along later on had painted over them, thinking that it was just like a mark, or you know, it's such a, again, another kind of complicated, rich idea that's also a kind of real life material manifestation of how we value and devalue life. So this is called Plantation Paint. Tabitha, the art conservator, squints at the color, tells me the paint depicting the black of these men huddled for a burial will decay before the cypress trees surrounding them will decay. There are several kinds of black, she says, and the cypress trees surrounding them is all I see as we stand alive in this otherwise empty gallery. Why am I like this? What am I like? Who does it matter to? All details question my way of seeing. I worry what kind of black would mark me. I am not the paint made from vine twigs or burnt shells. I am not the lamp full of oil. Tabitha, tell me how you'd paint me. Tell me if I'm closer to the white painter with my name than I am to the black preacher, his hands wide to the sky, the mahogany wrought of heaven. Sorry, but you know by now that I can't mention trees without every shade of my family appearing and disappearing.
Been listening to Raymond Antrobus read from his latest collection, All the Names Given. So I wanted to spend a moment talking about writing about your own family, particularly when it involves living family members. So like, for instance, we just heard a poem where Tabitha's in the poem. It's a question that often comes up for memoir writers. What considerations people have about representing people. But also in one conversation, you were talking about the autobiographical elements of a lot of your poetry. And you made clear that these poems are not therapeutic or a form of poetry-mediated therapy. And that actually that when you're working on a collection, you make sure that you're also seeing a therapist to make sure that you have a place external to the poetry for the therapeutic. So I wondered if you could talk about both of these things. Like, what are your considerations when you're writing about a close family member or loved one who might read your work? And then this question of the therapeutic.
So one of the ways that I want to answer this is, I suppose, by talking about my education as a teacher at Goldsmiths University. You know, my MA was called a spoken word teacher MA, but actually I spent not that much time kind of writing and reading poetry, and a lot more time creating a pedagogy for the classroom in which I'm able to basically serve as someone who is functioning as an advocate for emotional literacy. So in the classroom, I'm more than just say a teacher, which is traditionally thought of as someone who's just standing there spewing facts at people for them to memorize and write down. And actually, it's more of a kind of sharing. You know, I spent a lot of time learning about different models of learning environments. What is a democratic classroom? What space does humor and storytelling have in the classroom? And how do we create that? How do we even assess it when we're talking about, you know, our intense exam culture, which is making a lot of us very sick, actually. You know, how do you get in there and subvert all of these things, which we know, looking at all the research, is actually to the detriment of learning and what learning is. You know, we learn about how stress on the brain, cortisol in the blood, prevents us actually retaining information. And yet, for some reason, we still have this culture which insists on this high pressure, high stress means to get someone to, you know, I don't know, it's so bizarre. So the idea is that poets, creative people can be in the classroom and provide some kind of antidote to what, again, what we see is actually like a pretty toxic environment, often especially like the higher up you go, the more money that is involved in education, seems the more the worse for you it gets. It's really interesting, actually, but also scary. Anyway, so my practice, this is a really long way of saying that my practice in the classroom as someone advocating and practicing emotional literacy serves a different purpose to coming out of that classroom and writing and publishing poetry. I do draw a line between those two spaces. For example, in the classroom, particularly with younger people, I spent most of my time working with teenagers. I found that teenagers, young people have so much to say, even, just generally. I've never met a teenager who doesn't actually have a lot to say, even if they're quiet or standoffish or whatever, like they've got something to say. And when you can get that out of them, and not just in a way that's, just purely therapeutic, but when that's part of the process, getting something out of them, and then getting them to do something creative with that thing that's going on in their life. Often it's like an autobiographical thing about them, and sometimes it's a difficult thing, sometimes it's not. But I've seen in this practice how, we've literally saved lives doing this. I've seen students, write or share something in a poetry workshop that has then led to very real and positive interventions. So we've, had a number of students write about self-harm. I've had a number of students write about losing someone close to them who they hadn't shared or confided with anyone in the school environment, and then it's come out, and then it's they've been able to be cared for and attended to in this way, and then so all of that though is different. Like I say, to like. If I was then going to take those students out of that classroom and say, okay, we're going to publish a book with Faber and Grey Wolf, like that's a different thing. Yeah. And, we were talking about audience earlier. That's a different audience, with different expectations, different experience. And quite frankly, I'm not interested in someone putting out work that is just kind of, I don't know if you want to call it like self-aggrandizing, therapy. I don't know. I don't want to sound like I'm judging or like I'm being like overly critical, but I'm talking about my own kind of practice and what it is I'm trying to do. And when I put out the Perseverance, I found that a lot of the interviews I was having, people were very kind of interested in a lot of the kind of autobiographical parts of it. I mean it's like, hey, no one's talking about the fact that like every other poem in here is a different form. Like, no one's talking about like, the craft basically. And I know again, the craft can be a complicated thing to talk about, in and of itself, and hierarchies and all this kind of stuff. But it is poetry, like it is a practice, it is a tradition. I am very invested in aligning my work with the poets that excite me, or that have moved me, or that I feel I'm in some kind of family with them. Like I do subscribe to this idea that through poetry, through active reading practice, you can create your own company, your own literary company, and that can be a very powerful, important, worthwhile, sustaining practice and thing to have as you move through your life. I take that seriously, and so I don't, so yeah, it's important to me to have a distinction between, a therapeutic practice and a poetry craft practice. I still feel like I'm being a bit um, maybe a bit. I don't know if I'm being fair in how this is coming out, but this is how it's coming out today.
Yes. Fair enough. So we'll put an asterisk by that response.
Yeah.
Well, there's another way in which I feel like you're an investigator of missing sounds beyond being an investigator of sounds that you do not hear, but you're also an investigator of sounds, I think, that are not spoken in the first place, of missing histories, that your ancestral investigations are part of that, but also lots of other things are too. For instance, when you were asked to engage with the legacy of Beethoven, you weren't interested in focusing on a narrative of, look at what this deaf person overcame, which you felt like was an overdone narrative. And instead you wanted to focus on a violinist that Beethoven collaborated with, George Bridgetower, who was mixed race with a Caribbean father, and who Beethoven dedicated the Kreutzer Sonata to until they had a falling out, and then Bridgetower was erased from the musical history that we know. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time on deaf history, because it's this interesting intersection between science and medicine and education, and a lot of really terrible examples of good intentions causing great harm. For several years, I was writing a lot of ear-centric work. And during that time, I read Oliver Sacks's book, Seeing Voices. And it was a book that did
you say ear-centric?
Ear-centric.
Ear-centric. I like
yeah,
that.
so,
I like that.
Yeah. And during that time when I was writing a lot about ears, I read Oliver Sacks's book, Seeing Voices. And at least for me, that really was a book that blew me away in showing me what I didn't know about deaf history. And I was going to ask you your opinion of this book, but then I saw that you had listed it in your further reading section. But what I loved about the book as a reader, as a hearing reader, is that Sacks comes from a certain natural bias, which he admits. He comes with a natural bias as a pathologist. And that bias being that, of course, if there were a technology invented that eliminated deafness, that would be a good thing. And yet he came away instead with something very different as an impression, an immense admiration for the culture of deafness and the unique qualities of sign language, so much so that after he wrote the book, he began himself to become a student of sign. But you've mentioned this early in the interview, but this dynamic that he goes through in this process he goes through sort of brings to the fore the difference between little d deafness, the medical condition, and capital D deafness, the culture, and how if the latter isn't recognized and the former is emphasized at its expense, the results are often disastrous. And I was wanting to spend a moment with you about that, because you engage with this in many different ways in the collections. For instance, you engage with the legacy of Alexander Graham Bell, who dedicated his life to the education of the deaf, but in such a way that it reversed a century of progress for deaf culture. His mother was deaf. His wife was deaf. The telephone arose partly as a result of his interest in deaf education and his belief in the possibility of a universal language. But his approach called oralism, where deaf people are denied sign language and encouraged not to marry other deaf people and to focus on speech therapy at the exclusion of signing, had really disastrous results. All that time learning to imitate speech sounds, for one, is time not spent learning math or learning science or learning literature or learning or interacting within sign language, which Sacks is very clear is complete language unto itself, even though as late as the 1950s, it was still not viewed as a true language, but rather as a sort of pantomime. And even many people don't realize that ASL or BSL are not signed English, but actually entirely different languages. But the irony of Bell's attempts to separate deaf people from each other with the goal of assimilating them is that in some ways, the most advantageous deaf person is one born to deaf parents because they get language acquisition without any gaps. And that's crucial. And Sachs was quoting the South African deaf poet David Wright, a poet who went deaf at 7 years old after he acquired language. And so he would hear what he would call phantasmal voices when he wrote, because he could still remember when he could hear those words, even though he lost hearing at 7. And he says his ability to imagine what being deaf pre-language acquisition with no access to language would be like is as hard for him to imagine as it would be for a hearing person to imagine. That it's not a question of degree, but of a fundamentally different scenario of somebody who loses hearing and is not given access to sign language or language while the brain is still plastic. I'm not sure where I'm going with this entirely, but I wanted to deliver all of that information because it's been something that I have to say naively, I was so shocked that I was never taught any of the history that I learned in that book. But I wondered about just if this sparks any thoughts for you, both because you are obviously meditating on these figures, Bell being just one of them who is engaging with pedagogy like you are and with science, but really causing great harm that is taken forever to start, but probably still going on, trying to reverse the process of oralism.
Yeah. That's still very much alive and well, the legacy of that. Even just in the UK in the last 5 years, we've seen even more deaf schools being closed. And this is capital D deaf schools. These are deaf-led deaf schools. One of the oldest of which was in Hastings in the suburbs part of England, and it's closed down now for good. And the kind of more prestigious deaf schools in the UK are still often the schools that practice the oral method, actually, that discourage sign as a first language and speech and oralism over that. So and you know, there are some students that benefit from that system, but many that leave damaged and traumatized from it. Many refuse to ever speak, to use, vocally, to, and just only do sign and don't speak to any of their biological family. And, I have a number of friends that are like that. It just cut everyone off. And only, interact and engage with the people that love them for who they are, their chosen family, who are also mainly deaf or deaf and sign language speakers. So it's, again, complicated kind of thing. Yes, I completely love Oliver Sacks for his book, Seeing Voices. I think that is a great model for anyone, actually, any outsider going into a community and wants to write about that community with kindness, generosity, intelligence, tact. Is wonderful. It's just brilliant. I don't know. I mean, I do know that there were a couple of deaf people who had some reservations about it. I personally defended Oliver Sacks because I didn't feel like he'd gone in there with any assumptions, or at least any assumptions that he wasn't willing to change his mind about. So you see how he changes his mind throughout the book. And that to me is pure investigative, meaningful, educational, work. Like it's just work. You see how someone goes from one point of view to another, and that changes purely through on the ground experience and actual communication. And then, like you say, he ends near the end of the book, he says, I continue to learn sign language. I continue to learn about deaf history and the culture and the history and the how can I say, the sensibility of deafness. He's completely a student in that, and not an authority. And I think that's where we often see kind of things go wrong, where people like Alexander Graham Bell had his own agendas, his own fixed vision, which he, but then you look at it, if you look at it compassionately, Graham Alexander Bell clearly had a lot of trauma, clearly felt like he couldn't communicate or connect with his mother, yet somehow ends up in, it was actually through family and friends and acquaintances that he meets his wife. And then, he invents the telephone. The man is a millionaire when he's in his 20s. There's a real kind of arrested development happening for him there. So it's like when you really look at, again, the emotional history of these factual kind of cold figures, you can see a little bit of further kind of complications in it, which actually enrich, and I think that history. But that's often not how history is taught or understood. And I should say that there are some great deaf scholars and historians. Harlan Lane is one of them. Paddy Ladd is another one who's done some really groundbreaking work, particularly on British Sign Language and the history of British Sign Language. So much of this stems, talking about legacy, so much of this stems as well from, the Enlightenment era, when people, the kind of takeaway from, hundreds of years of philosophy of this one question, what makes us human? The answer was language. That was the thing that they all agreed on. Language makes us human. And then suddenly they started putting up barriers around what a language is. So like you say, well into the 50s, sign language still not recognized as an official language. It wasn't until 2003, which is the year I left secondary school education, which would be high school in the US. 2003 wasn't it, when British Sign Language was recognized as an official language, so well into my life at this point. And I remember that. I remember I just left school. I just left this deaf school. And then suddenly it was announced that the government want to recognize BSL as a language, but they don't want to teach it in schools, but they don't want it on the curriculum. And we're still, to this day, there's an activist, a young teenage activist by the name of Daniel Gillings, who is doing incredible campaign work to get BSL on the national curriculum in the UK. And that, again, that's a very specific thing. I'm not sure. It seems, I don't know how true this is, but I did get an impression that ASL, it does have a presence in American education, it seems. But I can't speak to that. I don't know. But I'm just bringing that up to say that that's kind of, they're two different histories, contexts. And you said earlier about like how I anticipate criticism from other deaf people, and just, I've received my fair share of deaf criticism from, from friends as well, actually, who has, who've just kind of questioned, how, just making sure that my practice is kind of grounded, and if I'm talking about deafness, that I'm bringing forward, deaf-led organizations, deaf-led activists, and movements, because I do have a privilege in cultivating my voice, to to be able to have this conversation right now, cultivating my language, and that is something I don't take that lightly. That's something I really try to weave into both those spaces, that classroom space and the work. So there are kind of overlaps of in terms of practice and impact, and what it is I'm hoping to move, how I'm hoping to move through the world, and the work itself move through the world. Because once a book is published, once it's out there, it's beyond you. You can't, people are going to do what they want, really, or take what they need or what they want from the work. And then I've had all kinds of, people take away things from my work that I've had no imagination of, actually. Even I get messages quite fairly frequently from people who have stammers or stutters, and say that they feel a kinship, I suppose, with elements of my work. And so that interests me as well, even thinking about the kind of Audre Lorde idea of there's always an intersectionality. There's an intersectionality with my work that I didn't consciously intend, but has come back to me in a way that has been a delight to see.
Well, you do have many poems that are or engage with historical deaf people, for instance, The Wife of Bell, and poems also that engage with representations of deaf people in literature, both more positive like Dickens and clearly negative with Ted Hughes. And you also have poems about unarmed deaf people and their deadly encounters with law enforcement or with anti-deaf prejudice. And I pulled out some of them, and I was hoping maybe we could read a trio of those poems if you were open to it. So the three poems I pulled forth were for Jessela Gellin, Vanessa Preville, and Monique Vincent. And The Ghost of Laura Bridgman warns Helen Keller about fame. And then finally for Tyrone Givens.
Okay, wow. Yeah, great choice. I've never been asked to read these poems, actually. Tyrone Givens I have, but not these ones. Okay, interesting. Yeah, I'll give it a go. For Jessela Gellin, Vanessa Preville, and Monique Vincent. When 3 deaf women were found murdered, their tongues cut out for speaking sign language, the papers called it a savage, ritualistic act. But I think the world should have gone silent, should have heard the deaf gather at St. Vincent, should have heard the quiet march towards Port-au-Prince. The British government did not recognize British Sign Language until 2002, BSL zone, deaf history. Before, all official languages were oral. The deaf were a colony the hearing world ignored. And now the irony that the words noise and London are the same sign in BSL. It is getting so loud, audiologists are preparing for the deafest generation in herd history. In Montego Bay, a sign written on the outside walls of the Christian Deaf School says, Isaiah 29:18, in that day the deaf shall hear, above a painting of a Green Hill paradise. Harriet, the only deaf teacher in the school, tells me no one speaks sign well enough to enter any visions of valleys. My dad never called me deaf. Even when he saw the audiogram, he'd say, "You're limited, so you can turn the TV up." He didn't mean to be cruel. He was thinking about his friend in school in Jamaica who stabbed another boy's eardrums with pencils. Dad never saw him in class again. Maybe that's what he was afraid of, that the deaf disappear, get carried away, bleeding from their ears. The ghost of Laura Bridgman warns Helen Keller about fame. They'll forget you, but not until men have sat close, touched your hands, asked their questions. What is divinity, eternity, insouciance? Your name will be scratched into reports, naming you proof that those born deaf or blind or both are worth an incapable God, a fragmented sermon. They will want to know if intelligence has a handshake. It took one man called Dickens to open my story to the world and call it how he saw, how he heard. Your danger is in his language. Don't let them twist your silence. The ear and eye are at the seat of their perception. We are centuries away from people believing our stories without perversion, without pity. Their speech will never really find a way into us. Will always be the sound of our separation. Who is testing God's hearing when you ask if my blood is dead? If I am dead, where is my thinking? Beware of Alexander Graham Bell. Decibel is his word. He never receives you. Oh, Helen, don't trust what you cannot say yourself. This poem is called For Tyrone Givens, and I wrote it after Tyrone was a friend of mine from school, and I found out that he committed suicide, and it was such a shock and moment for for anyone who finds out a friend of theirs has decided to take their own life. So I didn't really know if I had anything to say about this other than it's tragic, it's sad, and it shouldn't have happened. I was invited to write a poem, though. I was commissioned to write a poem responding to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I had to look at them and choose one to respond to. And one of the declarations, number 5, says, "No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment." And I instantly thought of Tyrone and the injustice which he lost his life, because of it. So I should also say that James Baldwin appears in this poem because during the pandemic, I realized that I was lying to people. I told them that I'd read every James Baldwin novel, and it was not true. I'd only read 2. So I made it my thing to make, once we're out of lockdown, I would be able to say, I really have read every Baldwin novel, and I can say that now. And you know what blew my mind? Every Baldwin novel has a suicide in it. And so that's partly why he appears in this poem. For Tyrone Givens. The paper said, putting him in jail without his hearing aids was like putting him in a hole in the ground. There are no hymns for deaf boys, but who can tell we're deaf without speaking to us? Tyrone's name was misspelled in the HMP Pentonville prison system. Once I was handcuffed, shoved into a police van. I didn't hear the officer say why. I was saved by my friend's mother, who threw herself in the road and refused to let the van drive away. Who could have saved Tyrone? James Baldwin attempted suicide after each of his loves jumped from bridges or overdosed. He killed his characters, made them kill themselves. Rufus, Richard, black men who couldn't live like this. Tyrone, I won writing awards, bought new hearing aids and heard my name through the walls. I bought a signed Baldwin book. The man who sold it to me didn't know you, me, or Baldwin. I feel I rescued it. I feel failed. Tyrone, the last time I saw you alive, I dropped my pen on the staircase. Didn't hear it fall, but you saw and ran down to get it. Handed it to me. Before disappearing, said, you might need this.
Been listening to Raymond Antrobus read from both of his poetry collections, The Perseverance and All the Names Given. I wanted to return to Sachs, but before I did, I just want to acknowledge what you said and around your engagement with the deaf community in a bigger sense of centering deaf voices. And it's the limitation of the fact that is the book that I've read that I'm that I'm so captivated by. But I do want to read the people you've mentioned. But he one of the things that was fascinating about the book for me was also two extremes that he portrayed. And I kind of wanted to just lay both of those out for a minute and hear your thoughts. Because on the one hand, pre-sign language development in France in the 18th century, at least in his characterization, pretty much prior to that, not only were deaf people usually considered quote unquote dumb and incompetent, they were unable to inherit property, to marry, to receive education, or given adequately challenging work. And at one point, Sachs is at Gallaudet University, which at the time he was there was the only liberal arts college in the world for the deaf.
Still is.
Still is, okay. And at the time he was there in the 1980s, it was being occupied and barricaded by the student body, who were demanding a deaf president, which they had never had in its 124-year history. And even there, where Sachs was utterly personally transformed, sitting in on classes in philosophy and chemistry and math that were all conducted in sign, even there, the administration treated the deaf student body in sort of an infantilized way in his mind. And Sachs said that the 20 years before that, so he's referring back to the 60s, that in the 60s there were less than a half dozen deaf people with PhDs in the world. Mm. And you've mentioned, and you were quick to clarify that the literacy rate scenario is problematic, but you've mentioned that the illiteracy rate among deaf people in Jamaica is 95%. Yeah. And 70% illiteracy in the UK. And in your conversation with Ilya Kaminsky, and then again here today, you've talked about how through much of your educational experience as a kid, you were met with low expectations from educators. Yeah. That was probably a nexus of both questions around deafness and questions around race. But I guess I wanted to say all of that and then read a quote from Sachs, because he also presents this other countervailing reality for him, which both speaks to lower D deafness, medical, and capital D deaf culture, but in his quote seems to mix the two. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on it. Is this appealing? Is this problematic, or is this both appealing and problematic? But it was really eye-opening as this completely different way to flip the script. So this is Oliver Sacks. In those who are born deaf, and most especially those who are exposed to sign from the start, that what would normally be auditory areas of the brain associated with hearing can be quote unquote reallocated for purposes of visual analysis. That with constant exposure to and use of a visual language, The entire brain of the deaf person can adapt itself for a special supervisual sensibility and organization, a special enhancement of visual powers that may not occur in any other situation. What neuroscientists have insufficiently regarded or respected, and have scarcely yet begun to explore, is the unusual quality of imagination and imagery in the deaf, particularities that the brain and mind have been taught through being exposed from the start to an exclusively visual sensibility. The language and culture and rich differentness of the deaf have a neurological basis. It is not just culture that is different in the deaf, but nature, the nature of their experiences, dispositions, and thoughts. Deaf culture is reared upon deaf nature, though at this point one almost has an impulse to drop the word deaf and replace it with visual, and to speak rather of an intensely visual culture emerging from a physiological enhancement of visuality. Sign, I am now convinced, is a fundamental language of the brain. Curious what that evokes in you. I mean, I think about like you have the text image sequence and all the names given. There's lots of engagement with visual art. There's the drawing of the hands signing in your books. What do you think of when you hear Sachs speaking into this?
I think he is speaking scientific brilliance. It's true. It's so true, and I can attest to that. When I did go through a period of just wanting to sign and not having, not having as many kind of voice conversations, and in that time, I would say that my periphery vision improved. I started to notice it. It widened. Also, my dreams changed. So the way that I would dream was that all my conversations were in sign. So I would dream about people who I know in real life, who I'm only able to talk to orally, vocally, and they could sign. And in my dreams became this like deaf utopia. I found that so, I know those are some of the best dreams I've ever had. Yeah. Honestly. And in how, like you say, in how visual and evocative they were for me, just growing up, waking from them. I still remember them. They really left an impression with me. I want to also mention the architecture and that as a kind of idea. The way that the world is built. The world is not built by deaf people, meaning the mainstream world, the hyper powerful capitalistic world that we recognize, as a city. It's just not built. I mean, maybe with the exception of Rochester, which I hear, 90,000 deaf people live in a single space. That's apparently the biggest deaf city or concentrated deaf population in the world. But generally, buildings, architects, designers are not thinking about sound and how sound travels and operates in a space. So if we had, let's say if civilization was to start all over again, and it was like a town meeting where we had to get a bunch of people in a room to design the equivalent of a constitution, and it was ground level. They literally had to build everything from scratch. I would hope that there are deaf people there, and differently, people with all kinds of perspectives in that space. Because I really do think that, if we're going to, this analogy of kind of new building or building Again, we're talking about inclusivity, and we're talking about I don't know, even just the power of the visual in some sense, or the power of the representative being understood in that way. Then that's how we've got to kind of go about it. And I remember, I mentioned Daniel Gillins, this deaf campaigner for sign language in the UK. I remember thinking about that analogy when I met him, and being like, when I met him, he was 13 years old. And I just thought, my God, we've got to get this deaf young man, the deaf young, he is a kid, into rooms, into powerful rooms where they are making buildings, where they are building things from the ground up, which are going to impact, how we live, how we view our life. And the brilliance of what the quote you just read from Oliver Sacks is that he is asserting a value on the deaf sensibility and the deaf being, the deaf personhood. And he's also going a step further and saying, we hearing people, or you hearing people, can learn from it. Mm-hmm. There's an actual physiological and intellectual lesson or advancement advantage here, actually. And I totally see it, and I totally agree with it. And even in the school I was at, I had deaf friends who I could, the ways some of my hearing peers would talk about some of my other deaf friends, it's just, we're kids, but it's still like, you really underestimate that kid because he's pretty cool. Yeah. He can do some pretty cool stuff. But at the same time, like these things, like, just to put it in the most kind of, I don't know, male sports-based field, I suppose, and field of language. Like there was a deaf football team, and you would call it soccer, but I'm going to say football as in soccer in America. But there was a deaf football team and a hearing football team. And the deaf football team of my year, we would beat the hearing team. And I remember when we beat them, when we beat the hearing team, the deaf team, I remember that was probably the closest that those hearing students had to the equivalent of what Oliver Sacks articulated there. I was like, hey, we got something to show you. Don't underestimate.
That's wonderful. I love that you just brought up both literal dreams and this dream utopia that you have while you're asleep, and then this dreaming for the future, right? Because dreams is a huge part of All the Names Given. Like the epigraph from Juan Ramon Jimenez, the body as it daydreams goes toward the earth that belongs to it from the other earth that does not. But I'm curious about dreams more generally, because in the collection as a whole, many of the poems are poems happening within dreams. So for much of the time, the poet is dreaming in this collection as we go through the collection. What is that about?
So that's just about, again, like within deaf poetics, the poetics of uncertainty. There's an uncertainty or a real kind of disability to dreaming, in the sense of like, you don't know what one is capable of in a dream. It all just unfolds in front of you in a way. And I was thinking of, I'm British, and a lot of English poetry from like the 15th, 16th, 17th century, which I started reading. There's loads of dream poetry. There's so many like dreamscapes and stuff that happen. Like there's all these like fables and just whole sequences that take place in dreams. And I saw this oh, I can't remember where I saw it now, but as a piece of language, it stuck with me. It said something like, "The dream is the striving of the soul," and I just resonated with that because there's a kind of non-linear, surreal kind of
Mhm.
truth to dreaming. Like that, and that whole idea that like everything you dream is actually a piece of you, no matter how bizarre it is. And in a way, it's kind of like, you really your soul really does kind of try to communicate in the dream. And I believe that, I've felt that, and to explore that poetically within the context you know of uncertainty and kind of mishearings and miscommunication, felt like a a poetic, a device that really has a place, you know, in that book and what I was trying to get at. Because also, like at the time I was writing them, me and my wife Tabitha, we were living in separate countries, not able to see each other because the immigration offices had shut down. So a lot of the language that comes into those dream kind of poems in Northern Thanksgiving is all actually kind of lifted from. That's what we would do. We would wake up and we would share a dream that we'd had the night before. It was a way for us to stay connected. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons.
Yeah. Well, for a final question, I want to stay with dreams and utopias. And I'm thinking of Sachs when he's exploring what was a longstanding cluster of hereditary deafness that occurred on Martha's Vineyard up until the 1950s, where everyone in this community, both hearing and deaf people, signed. So up until then, it was perhaps suggests a different way of being, where even the hearing people among themselves would mix speaking and sign, and the deaf people in the community were included in a way that was at least partly on their terms.
Yeah.
In that spirit, I want to read a quote from Meg Day as a preface to a final question. So they've said, so much of one's experience as dis can be dictated by non-disabled folks. I'm trying to think about my poetics outside that paradigm, but it's kind of foolish. I was taught to write for a non-disabled hearing reader. I came up knowing that part of what made a poem is its musicality, its sonic play. But play is such a misnomer. Hearing folks don't want you to just play with sound. They want you to play with sound in majors and minors, chords and harmonies. Even what we call dissonance in a poem is a certain kind of bending, a certain kind of agreement with the way hearies process sound. I've memorized rhymes. I know where in the mouth you like your vowels to match. It's a lot of labor, and who gets to enjoy it? Who benefits? Whose poetics are erased? I'm done with that. I'm working on being done with that. So in the light of that, as your poetry and your poetics evolves, the writing, the teaching, and the performing that you've made into a nexus, the use of sign in the books, and now the work with captioning, not just as captioning, but as a different mode, a different poetics. I wonder, when you look at the horizon and dream, where do you see your curiosity or your ambition leading you in terms of your poetry now?
Ooh. I mean, that question keeps me aligned with the poetics of uncertainty. I don't know, man. I don't know. Honestly, like all the names given, I set out to write a very different kind of book, and it came into what it was. And so I really loved writing for children in a way that really surprised me. I did it. I wrote this children's book, Can Bears Ski, quite reluctantly, actually, because I wasn't sure if, I don't know, there's kind of a snobbery in the like literary world about that, and I kind of felt like I'd internalized some of it maybe, but I felt I could see such a concrete place for that book in the world, considering the lack of books with deaf protagonists, with deaf stories, and going into deaf schools and looking at their library and seeing even in those libraries, there weren't many books. It was some, but just not enough, not nearly enough. So yeah, I'd like to do more of that, especially being a dad now and thinking and looking at language. And my son, just in the last week, has started to become more vocal. He's doing lots of gu and ah and ba and boo. He's practicing his consonants at the moment, it seems, and some of his vowels. And so it's like, wow, this is interesting. Here it is, like the lived experience of developed language being developed in front of me. Yeah. and I now get the privilege, the honor, burden as well to give him language and to pass that on, and I'm gonna give him sign. I want to teach him in a way that he can develop some sign and speak. And that's what's been best for me. Like, there are people that have been quite, Graham Alexander Bell is at one end of pure oralism, never sign, otherwise, you limit yourself. And for me, in a way, like even the kind of militant deafness, which is voice off, only sign, like don't speak to anyone who can't sign. I feel like there's a limitation to that too. But again, this is a personal thing. So for me, the thing that's helped me thrive in the world is the integration of both, of the signed, of the written, of the spoken, and trying for all of them to kind of coexist. But I hope I'm doing that in a way that's not trying to prescribe, or be didactic to that. It really is, and that's why I say, we were talking earlier, an investigation of missing sound. That investigation of missing sound is a kind of life work for me. It's like, if you put everything I create, I'm going to create in a folder, in a box, or in a shelf, it's going to be called an investigation of missing sound. So that's almost like a placeholder title for anything I write. So whatever I write in the future will be in that folder, on that shelf.
Yeah. Well, let's go out with the final poems and all the names given. I was thinking maybe we could hear Lovable and closer captions.
Okay. Lovable. The first time you told me you loved me, I didn't say it back, which is to say that I was not lovable. Those who have loved me before say I made them feel second to some dream I was having. The thing with dreams, you're the only one that sees them. So when I say I didn't know what was talking the first night you said you loved me, I mean I needed to hear it in the morning, hear it said when neither of us could be anyone except who we are. Closer captions after Christine Sunkin. Muffled. Sound of one story. Heart accelerating. Sound of skin covering bodies. Sound of wider seeing. I lose my hearing aids and move more fluid. The same way I do when I swim, the way I do when I sex. The thing the neighbors hear through the walls is me being pushed out of myself. It's silence that stills the noise in my eyes. Reader, this is the place I try to take you when I close them.
Thank you so much, Raymond. It was a real honor to be with you.
Likewise. I've been a big fan of the show, so it's just such a surprise, and yeah, like I say, it's just great. Like, been listening to you, talking to so many of my favorite writers and peers and people. So yeah, no, great. Your generosity and the depth that you go in with your guests. And particularly poets. Poets often don't get that kind of strenuous, scholarly, but also kind of loving attention. So I thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. We've been talking today to Raymond Antrobus about both of his latest books out this year from Tin House, The Perseverance, and All the Names Given. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener and reader-sponsored, full-strength, makeshift home office of me, David Naiman. You can find more of Raymond Antrobus's work at raymondantrobus.com, and I definitely encourage you to check out his video gallery there in particular. If you enjoyed today's conversation, consider becoming a supporter of the show. One of the potential benefits of becoming a supporter of Between the Covers is the bonus audio archive, which includes bonus material from Tisha Jen, Jory Graham, Alice Oswald, Padra Gotuma, Douglas Kearney, Diran Negrifa, Arthur Z, Teju Cole, Ted Chang, Layli Long Soldier, Richard Powers, and many others. There are also rare collectibles from past writing guests, the Tin House Early Readership Program, the collective brainstorm about who we should invite going forward, and much more. You can find out about all of this and more at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Or, if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so by PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team who helped make this show run as smoothly as it does. Elizabeth DeMeo and Elisa Ogie in the book division, Jacob Balla in the art department, Becky Kramer in publicity, and Lance Cleland, the director of the summer and winter Tin House Writers Workshops. And finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating the outro. Their album Imre Lodbrog is Sa Petita Mi can be found on iTunes, and Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.